y'all, so last week we made our paper plate loom and we made our warp using our Plarn or our plastic bag yarn. This week we're actually going to start weaving with what's left of our plastic yarn or our weft. So the first thing you want to do is to tape your Plarn to the middle of your tape right underneath your warp. Be careful while you're doing this because you can't take your warp off. You just have to sneak the piece of tape and your Plarn right underneath the warp and tape it to the middle of your paper plate. Try your best not to tape your warp as well. Once your weft or your Plarn is secured, you can actually start weaving. Be sure to mark where your starting point is. I took a highlighter and actually highlighted on the edge of my paper plate where I thought my starting point was and highlighted the Plarn itself. Now, if you highlight the Plarn, give it time to dry so the highlighter doesn't come off on your hands. And then you just start feeding your Plarn over one piece of warp, under the next, under one, over the next. You're just going to repeat this pattern of over, under until you get back to your starting point. Now this is where a few people got off last week, and I told you it was okay. It's an easy fix, and here it is. Now when you get to your second round of going over and under, it needs to be the opposite of your first round. So when we first started, we went under first, and now we need to go over our starting point. If you have an odd number of lines, you should be able to just keep going and it doesn't matter. But if you have an even number, just pick up the loop and go through the middle of it and act like it's another piece of the warp. We're just going to do this so that our weaving gets off and you can have your next round be the opposite. This is why we need to mark our starting point. This is always going to be your checkpoint to make sure you're doing the opposite from what you were doing the last round. And every time you do a round, make sure you pull your Plarn tight, but do so gently so that you're not breaking it. If you do break it, no big deal, just tie it back together. Now I'm going to show you what to do. So right now you can see I'm just going over, under, and I'm doing a couple of pieces of my warp at one time. And then I'm going to stop and start pulling all of my Plarn through. Pulling all the Plarn through takes a little bit because I didn't think about it until I actually got started, that you should probably start with a smaller amount of Plarn. We will use everything that we've made so far, but sometimes it's just easier to start with a smaller amount so that you just have less to pull through. And then you can add on later. I also forgot to mark my starting point, so that's what I'm doing now. Now that I'm back at the beginning, I need to alternate my weaving technique here so it is the opposite of my last round. So I'm going to pull that little piece apart at my starting point, that loop there, and I'm going to go through it. And make sure you go through the right one or under the right one so that it is the opposite. That's the hardest part, is just making sure you're doing the opposite of what you've done before. And you can always just check. So I went over this piece before, and so now I need to go under. Now I should be able to follow my pattern of over, under, until I get back around to my starting point. Making sure as I go that it's the opposite of the last round. Make sure that you also gently pull your Plarn through to make it tight. And you can tell in a minute I get really frustrated and just snip off a lot of my Plarn and tie it back together later. And that's okay if you want to do this. You are just going to continue this process of over and under and checking yourself again at your starting point. And you can tell if you're doing it right When your Plarn starts building outwards, that little circle in the middle, it starts getting bigger and bigger. And you know if you're not doing something quite right, or if you're not alternating over under, if your Plarn just builds up into a ball in the center. Your circle should be fairly flat. Also remember, if your Plarn breaks, you can always tie it back together or add more to it. You want to go until you run out of Plarn or until you actually fill up the entire paper plate. But we will spend one more week on this project. You can see here that it really is starting to look like a wicker basket, and you can see the pattern of it going under and over and how it's getting wider as it goes out and how flat it is. And I'm excited to see what you have gotten done so far. And if for some reason you're not able to complete this project, make sure you are reading your Seesaw assignments. I do have an alternative assignment for each one.